So, Chardonnay. I have a very true love-hate relationship with this varietal wine. Because when I moved from France to California, that was really the biggest cultural shock for me. I was fortunate to have spent 10 years in Burgundy, in Dijon, to work in a research laboratory. And, through visiting wineries, through having dinners with friends, I had been exposed to Chardonnay wines. And that's how I built up my mental representation of what Chardonnay should taste like. But when I moved to California, that was a complete different story. I had lost all my benchmark because the wines there were like very alcoholic, very toasty, lots of ripeness in the fruit, and I couldn't recognize the wine. So that was really my cultural shock. And really, I didn't drink Chardonnay for many, many years. But I've changed over the years. And one thing that helped me start to appreciate Chardonnay wines a little bit more is this study. When I was at the winery, at Gallo Winery, we did a huge study on preference of consumers of Chardonnay wines. And with colleagues, we tasted 50 or 60 different Chardonnay wines that were available on the US market. And we identified 14 different styles that overlapped, but they were from very neutral, natural flavors, very subdued wines to very heavy Burgundian with nutty notes, toasted oak, even a bit of sulfury component. So that made me realize, how many different styles there were out there. So I changed my mind. So I'm happy to talk about Chardonnay today. So let's dive into the core characteristic of the varietal wines. So that's the third varietal wine that we are studying inside the Curious Palates community. We started with Riesling last month, Pinot Noir, so Chardonnay this month. Chardonnay is a bit different than Riesling in Pinot Noir. It doesn't really have a typicity, and that's what makes it, so interesting as well. I like this representation because it really shows us that, on the basis after alcoholic fermentation, when the fruit is pressed, the sugar transforms into alcohol. If you just taste the wine like that, it can be very neutral. But there are different layers that enable the creation of these different styles that I was talking about earlier on. So it doesn't have really a fixed aromatic profile like Gewürztraminer or Riesling. It's very neutral. And that's make it very exciting, I suppose, for winemakers to work with. So the different layers of components that really impact the sensory profiles are, of course, the climate, but also the different fermentations that the wines are going through and the impact of the oak treatment, the time in barrel that we will look into a little bit more. So it's really a mirror of what the wine goes through from growing in a particular environment, the climate, what we call terroir, the soil, exposition, etc., of the grapevine, to all the manipulation, in all respect of the wine, all the manipulation that winemaking can make to alter the sensory profile of the wine for a particular purpose. So I know that in traditional wine education, we always start to look at the color. When I taste, I look at the color at the end, and I recommend you to do the same. But what is interesting with color is that in Chardonnay, it's more like a stylistic indicator because it's really linked to the ripeness of the fruits at harvest, but also the climate. So in cooler climates, you will see wines that are more like pale yellow in hue and intensity, to a warmer climate where the wines have more a golden hue in its appearance. Of course, climate is one thing, but the condition at harvest, the use of the vat, the container in which the wine is fermented, whether it's stainless steel, it happens in Chablis, or the use of oak barrels, this type of treatment during the fermentation will have an impact on the color. So if we are in stainless steel, we have paler wines. When we use oak, we tend to have more pronounced golden hues as well. So that's the appearance, the color. In terms of the fruit aroma spectrum, again, a huge impact of the climate, but also of the subsequent winemaking treatments. In cooler region, the wines tend to be higher in the perceived acidity, the acidic taste, and you have expressions of these fruits, lemon, green apple or apple, orchard tree, type of fruits that are quite typical in cooler climate for Chardonnay. And for those of you who are keen on chemistry, flavor chemistry, these aromas are expressed by esters during the alcoholic fermentation. So these are typical aromas of cooler climates, as well as stainless steel wine fermentation. But as you increase the temperature and the ripeness of the fruit, we go into more stone fruit aromas, so peach, apricot, tropical notes, pineapple, mango. And these aromas are evoked by compounds called lactones and norisoprenoids like beta-damascenone. And we have talked about lactones and beta-damascenone in the Riesling class because they are typical aromas of these peach apricot characteristics. So really the fruit aroma expression really tracks with climate and the ability of the fruit to retain its acidity. In terms of structure, what recently scientists, on the structure, we distinct the taste component and the mouthfeel component, the taste component being the results of what we perceive on our tongues, on our taste buds, and the mouthfeel, which is all these physical sensations in the mouth that is mainly due to friction of the liquid, on the surface of our mouth. And the components that affect taste and mouthfeel are tannins, those phenolic compounds that are present in grapes, in the berries, the skin, or the stem. But in Chardonnay, there are very low to no tannins in the composition of the wine. Now maybe if, depends on how the fruit is processed at harvest. But in general, there is not a lot of what professionals call phenolic grip, which is, what I would say astringency. It's not really dry, that doesn't dry your mouth like some red wines would. We talk about this type of mouthfeel, drying mouthfeel for Pinot Noir last month. Acidity, again, it's an important parameter, and it really drives the sensations that you have in your mouth. So acidity not only is a taste, that you perceive on your tongue, but it generates this mouth-watering mouthfeel because you salivate a lot. So that's, usually how we can identify an acidic wine. You have this mouth-watering sensation. And when you see crisp on the back label of a wine, usually that's what it means. It's quite acidic. It's not a bad thing. It just, it helps with the freshness, the perception of freshness of the wine as well. And when you have low acidity, well, the wine becomes a bit softer and it's not as, mouth-watering. It might be perceived, more heavy. And we'll see that a secondary fermentation that is conducted on Chardonnay called malolactic fermentation also contribute to the softness of the mouthfeel of the wine. And in terms of texture, again, I call it mouthfeel, but wine books and wine professionals call it texture. It ranges from very lean wines, what I call unidimensional, like there is not a lot of complexity. It's just like, it's maybe very fluid. There is no layers of mouthfeel. It's really unidimensional, but it can evolve into perception of chalkiness or almost like, some grits in your mouth or oily or waxy. So when the wine becomes thicker, they also with malolactic fermentation, we'll touch upon later on, it contributes to the perception of creaminess. And sometimes, it goes over than creaminess. It feels almost oily or waxy in your mouth. So those are wines that have evolved quite a bit. So you can have a wide range in terms of the taste and mouthfeel perception from very high acid to low acid to very fluid liquid, so to speak, to more complex mouthfeel in your mouth. Again, that makes the wine interesting. We just saw what the typical Chardonnay grape tastes like, neutral, but how these different components, the aromas, the texture, the taste, mouthfeel can evolve. Let's look at those external influencers that people have in hand to really influence the sensory profile of Chardonnay.